Here we go then, back with a solo Q&A, and we have got 31 questions to get through and a huge range of topics. But let's kick off with number one. If you were to wrap your specific knowledge under one title/theme, what would it be? I think the most obvious theme that comes to mind for me is self-development. That's the core theme of the podcast. That's the core theme of what I write about. That's the core theme of what I post about. And it also gives me a lot of scope to apply myself in any of the areas of life that you can choose to work on and improve. So any area that you can self-develop in, that gives me the free reign to go into that. So that could be health, it could be fitness, it could be business, it could be career, it could be relationships, it could be investing, it could be anything at all that you think is important within your life that you wanted to improve on. So that's probably where my specific knowledge lies. It's not as specific as I would maybe hope to be, but I also like the variety of what I'm able to talk about and what I'm able to bring to the table. Number two, what are your motivations for starting boxing training, and what does finished look like on this journey? Competent or fight ready? Some of you will have seen that I've been posting that I've been training on Monday with Sean Lazzarini, who is a Commonwealth champion based in Glasgow. I think the motivations for starting, I've looked physically capable for a long time now through my weight training. I haven't played a physical sport to express that physicality since I was 19 when I played rugby, when I stopped playing rugby. I feel as a man that I should have the ability to defend myself and move with a level of intent and purpose and confidence that comes from being physically capable. Now, while I look physically capable and while I have pretty high levels of self-confidence, I think it's important that I can actually apply that. This is probably influenced by conversations I've had both on this platform on recorded, but also unrecorded conversations that I've had in person, probably most notably with Richard Dixon and with Nathaniel Collins, who both of whom have competed in the fighting space. Nathaniel actually just had another win as a pro boxer, which was amazing to see. In terms of being finished and what does this journey look like, finished is almost never possible in any domain. Like, I'm never going to be finished with my physique. I'm probably never going to be finished with the podcast because, let's say, for example, like, I'm trying to think of it. Say I do interview Jordan Peterson. I'm not going to stop the week after. I'm going to go want to interview somebody else and bring more value and have more exciting conversations. It's never going to be done. So when it comes to being finished, there's certainly no plans for me to get into a ring at all. I'm still a total novice. I'm so new to it. I've genuinely had 6 sessions with Sean up until this point, who is really helping me come on leaps and bounds, but it's still so early. It still feels so foreign. So I guess finished would be a level of competence where I feel I can do the drills that I find difficult at the moment more easily, or with a greater level of precision and skill. Question 3, another boxing question. In regards to boxing, are you prepared to do sparring, knowing your brain is your commodity in the podcasting and sales game? It's a very good point. I haven't graduated to that level yet where sparring is even a sensible decision. We sparred once with body shots only, my brother and I, and that was a huge step up from the pads and the bags, which I'm still really new to as well. And the adrenaline rush was crazy, to be fair. And yeah, that was interesting. I don't think sparring is going to be a massive focus, but as I become more competent, I would imagine it would be considered. But I don't know if we would do headshots or what safety equipment we would use to protect my brain. As you say, it is my commodity. I think it's the same for a lot of people, and I guess the upside from getting rattled around wouldn't be massive for me. I don't know. I'd have to think about it when the time comes. Number 4, dream location to live in. Doesn't have to be from ever, just somewhere you'd love to live. I'm really strongly drawn to Dubai at the moment. I think that trip that I had November, December was amazing, and the network of people that I identified out there, but also I saw as potential people to network with, alongside the weather and the lifestyle and the general ethos of, yes, there's flashy showboating elements to it, but there's a lot of like very hardworking, very focused, very aligned individuals out there. And I think the weather for 6 months of the year would definitely suit my lifestyle, and it's a consideration at this moment in time how that might work. Question number 5, does cardio kill gains? Not necessarily, but it can if you don't manage your recovery and your nutrition alongside it. I would certainly say it's easier to build strength and muscle and an aesthetic look when your recovery and nutrition are geared towards that one single goal, which is aesthetics and how you look. And that's why I sometimes have been semi-critical of training approaches like CrossFit or functional fitness, where people are talking about, oh, it'll get you in the best shape of your life. It might do, but it probably won't do it optimally. It might well do it from an aesthetic or an enjoyment perspective, though, which is vital. I don't think cardio has killed my gains. I've done more work with the assault bike after my leg days to build a little bit of aerobic capacity and also just make sure I'm a little bit fitter. I walk 10 to 12 to 14,000 steps every single day at a relative pace where I can hold a conversation, but I'm not, how would I describe it? I'm not like, I'm a tiny bit out of breath, so to speak, which I think is important to do. That whole zone 2 concept, which both Fergus Crawley and Yusuf Smith have spoken about on the podcast before, and the benefits of that. A lot of people are leaning into that. So I don't think cardio has killed my gains from that perspective, because that's easy to recover from. Question number 6. What's your thoughts on power slap? Do you think it's a sport or just brutality? And do you think you'd be any good at it? I had to Google this. This is flown under my radar. And how strange is this? Somebody effectively sits there and is slapped with like unbelievable force. It looks pretty violent to me. So there's an element of brutality. And while there's technique and athleticism required to excel at that particular venture, it's a strange concept to me. But I'm going to try and play devil's advocate and say that maybe our ancestors felt that way about darts or about rugby, about football, about golf. I will say, though, I am a traditionalist, and that usually means that sports should have an element of fairness to them. And if I'm thinking about combat sports like boxing, which we've talked about already in this podcast, you aren't made to just stand there and take punches. There's a sporting opportunity to move, employ your footwork, and you have to earn the right to strike your opponent if you're able to get through their guard or round their guard or whatever you do. Whereas with this power slap game, you just sit there and get whacked. And yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about it. In terms of how I would get on at it, I think I can generate good force when it comes to strength for my size, but I also don't know if I yeah, I haven't practiced the technique, so I couldn't possibly comment. I'm getting better at punching pads though, so maybe it'd be a transferable skill. Question number 7. Are you brave enough to say what a woman is? Maybe this was designed to trip me up, because I've had questions that are similar to this before from anonymous accounts, and this again has come from an anonymous account without a display photo and without following anyone. But I'm happy to answer it. For me, a woman is an adult female with female reproductive parts, and I think that's the end of the story. And I think in any other era, this question would be answered immediately without any form of caveat around it. But that's my answer at this moment in time. Question number 8. What are the biggest changes you've ever had to make? This was an interesting question, because I consider myself to have lived a pretty easy, privileged life to an extent. Of course, there's been elements of struggle and elements of challenge, and there's been elements of having to make changes to things that really couldn't stay the same if I wanted to live in line with my values. And that brings me to give a bit of a top to this conversation, where I'm going to talk about what Sahil Bloom spoke about when I interviewed him. He spoke about destruction and rebirth, and he had 3 elements to it. So when he was destroyed and then he was reborn, were the changes that he had to make in his life. And he spoke about 3 in particular. The first was when he was the dumbest kid in class at Stanford, because he was used to being like one of the cleverest when he was at his school, and he was qualifying to get to university. The second was when he realized his baseball career was over and he wasn't going to make it at the very, very top level. And the third was when he left private equity to become the writer and content creator that we see online now. So he was destroyed on 3 particular occasions, or he destroyed previous versions of himself and made a change. And I think that's a way that we can all view it as well. And that was a really interesting interview overall. For me, I would list a few different ones. I've got recovering from an unexpected company-wide redundancy in 2019. If you've not listened to episode 15 right back in the archives, and that tells the story of that in a bit more depth. But that was certainly a time where I was making a huge change in identity, because I became somebody that had just left another company, moved to a new one. The whole thing got bought over by an American hedge fund, and I had to redefine myself and go and find a new job straight away when I was kind of used to being quite a secure employee. The second, I would say, is probably like ending a relationship that from the outside most people would assume was going pretty well, and that was in January 2020. Again, that's a big change that I chose to make and I needed to make and I decided to make. Number 3, leaving the insurance industry in May 2021. So coming up for 2 years now for a more purposeful and fulfilling and financially rewarding career, which is certainly proven to be up until this point. So very pleased with that change. And then last, and I've left this one to last because this is what we're doing just now, I'd say hitting record on the podcast and starting recording in March 2020 was pretty significant, because I think whenever I meet somebody who's a passing acquaintance that knows that I create content online, the podcast comes up as a topic of conversation. And these were all big changes and often meant leaving something behind that you thought was okay or reasonable. It wasn't like a huge amount of pain, but it wasn't great. So you embraced the discomfort of a new reality and you made a change. So I would certainly encourage anyone that's listening to this that's thinking, oh, this situation is not bad, it's okay. Could it be better? Could it be great? If so, can you take the actions to move towards a better tomorrow? Okay, longer question, this one. Number 9, I heard you own your own apartment. Do you have any thoughts on ground rent increases? I'm struggling to sell with a 5-year rent review period. So this relates to legislation in England and Wales, which relates to freeholding. Now, for clarity, I own my property in Scotland, so I'm not massively well versed in this particular area because we have a different system where we have factors rather than this system. Now, when it relates to freeholding, and the term you've used is ground rent, this is rent paid by the owner of a building to the owner of the land which the building is built on. And my understanding when I Googled this around actual costs of it, it's about £400 per year on average, but there's going to be ones that are much higher up the other end, and then there's going to be ones that are lower, which bring the average down. But ground rents were mostly abolished in 2022 with the Leasehold Return Reform Act, and it was replaced by what's called a peppercorn rent, which is almost nothing whatsoever, almost zero pretty much. So this is for older properties. You're seeing a lot of resistance from the market to potentially having to pay this ground rent, and that is probably what's making it more difficult for this individual to sell their property. Now, I don't have any massive thoughts on it other than it sounds quite outdated, but I also understand if I was a landowner and a lot of properties were built on my land, I would probably want to maintain this. So there's got to be a perspective from all sides here. Okay, interesting. Number 10, Chat GPT, bullish or bearish? I am bullish for some areas, but very bearish in others. You may have heard me speak to Eric Daimler on the podcast, who spoke about the future of artificial intelligence. And I think AI is going to replace a lot of things, but not everything. And importantly, I think we still value what you would call the relative randomness and uniqueness that humans bring to some tasks, instead of almost the rote perfection that a machine brings. Now, there's some measures of writing that you can do when it comes to a particular medium called perplexity, which just shows how indicative something is that it was written by a machine or written by a human. So is it written by something that was entirely trained to the absolute maximum in the nth degree to be perfect? Or was it written by a human that has certain caveats or certain different styles or certain different ways of conveying information? So one thing that AI will continue to lack unless it's trained otherwise, which is obviously quite likely, I would say, is flair and nuance. So things like tone, pacing, style, color of language, that will be less likely to be big in AI than if content is written by a human. So I'm bullish on it eliminating some faff, but I also am bearish that we become too reliant on technology, and inevitably AI has the potential to run away from us in terms of how much we want it to do. And that should be something that we should all be cognizant of, particularly if we while it's going to take some jobs, it might create others. I do think it's going to have a net negative on people who don't invest in skills which robots potentially can't do. A quick drink of water here, and then we'll get into number 11. Do you see luxury watches as a broader investment strategy for you? I had a few messages regarding the watch that I just purchased after the Mike Samuels podcast on YouTube, which was the first time I'd worn a watch, or the new watch, for the podcast and people could potentially see it, and those that are kind of watch heads that kind of notice that. So I recently bought a watch through a dealer on Instagram who are called What's On Watches, which is WATTON. It's sorry, WATTSOON watches. And I don't have a buying history with Rolex, so I needed to go through what you would maybe term the grey market, and these guys were well positioned to help me find the one I wanted. And for me, it's not necessarily an investment immediately at this moment in time. It's more of a personal purchase, and it's a watch that I have wanted for a long period of time. However, if you're talking from an investment perspective, I understand there are some capital gains exemptions that are applied to watches, and it's similar to some wines where, because it's deemed to have a limited lifespan, it's not fully taxable. The threshold's normally about 50 years. So equally, the profit on selling a watch might be lower than the threshold for capital gains anyway. But like, say for example, if you made like £1,000 profit on selling a watch, that's not going to be liable for capital gains. But over a longer period, it might be much greater than that, and it could be exempt from that. So if that was an investment strategy, you could be saving on tax versus selling crypto or selling stocks and shares or selling property, which I think is an interesting consideration. But this one is more so a purchase for me individually. And while it's attractive that the asset that I purchased is going to maintain its value, it's more for me from like a marking of my ability to afford a watch that I've wanted for a long time. Question number 12. Do you think more young people are putting money into watches and high value jewelry due to the cost of living crisis? I.e., someone on £1,800 a month can manageably save around £10,000 for a deposit, but can't afford to keep up with the payments for the property. They have cash in their pocket, so decide to play with it in a different realm. This is very interesting, and a follow one from the other watch question. I had a couple other watch questions that were more about make and model, but I'm not going to necessarily get into that. I think that this particular question is slightly leading in that it's getting towards a decision that maybe somebody's made that they would rather invest in watches than property. But I think that may be a trend that we're seeing. I'm not too sure what the statistics look like, but I do know that watches and high value jewelry are more immediately gratifying than saving for a house. There's an element of I can get my hands on it quicker, and there's less upkeep costs, which I think is an important consideration when we're talking about property. Because I remember when I purchased this flat, I didn't realize quite how much it would cost me to furnish it. I underestimated how much Wi-Fi, gas, electric, council tax, factor fees, which is a Scottish requirement, were all going to add up to much more than you realize when you're necessarily got like a particular figure in mind, when you're like, this is what I'm going to pay for my deposit and this is what I'm going to pay for my mortgage each month. There's so much more to consider. So I can certainly understand that somebody would think, okay, well, if I've got 10 grand, maybe I buy this particular Rolex rather than buying the house. But I think they're in separate domains for me. Like I have always optimized for affording the nicest possible house in the nicest possible area with the best possible surroundings rather than material items. But I can certainly see why that's the case. And equally, now that I've got the watch that I've got, I'm very pleased with it. And it's but it came after a house for me, after a property. And definitely can. But yeah, I would love to see the stats. If somebody has the stats, please do ping me them on Instagram or on my email list, and I'll be more than happy to maybe talk about this on the next solo podcast, which will be in 10 episodes time. Number 13, do you wish you could live/work more remotely? Reference to Amin, who you recently interviewed. He's able to spend a month or two in different countries and climates. Great question. I've mentioned Dubai already, and could you imagine being there during the winter in the UK and Scotland when it's grim? That's really appealing. You'd be there for 6 months when it's sunny and warm and reliable, and you can plan your day and know that it's not going to be disrupted by weather. But regarding like moving around a month or two in different locations and climates, no. I'm a creature of habit and routine, and I really enjoy getting into a flow. So regularly moving between different ones wouldn't excite me as much. I don't really optimize for novelty. Now that's a strength and a weakness. But for me, if it was like 6 months here and 6 months there, that would be much more up my street. Question number 14. If you had to pick a university housemate, would you pick Luke or Tom Stoltman? This is a hard one because I think both have their upsides, and then both obviously are going to eat all the food in the house and probably make me feel tiny and skinny on a daily basis and probably make me want to bulk up a bit. But I think Luke would be more organized and more like a big brother, because he's a big brother to Tom. He'd be a big brother to me in terms of age as well and kind of world knowledge. He'd also encourage me to go for cold dips in the sea and in nature in the morning. So that would be cool. That would be a benefit. Tom and I, we would talk about Rangers nonstop. So that's a big temptation as well. And I think everyone knows that I'm probably already quite good at getting out into nature. I'm not too scared of doing a cold dip. So maybe Tom and I just chatting about Rangers all day long would be the winner for me. Number 15. Why do you think we're so quick to give grace or forgiveness to others, but not to ourselves? This links into the whole being harsher on ourselves than we are on others and holding ourselves to a different standard to those around us. One of my favorite rules for life from Jordan Peterson is rule number 2, and that is treat yourself like you're someone you're responsible for helping. And this links to self-care and genuinely looking after yourself and giving grace, as the question said. I think we're evolutionarily predisposed to be harder on ourselves to support our own survival in the future, as in, I'd rather be harder on myself about the mistake that could have led to me being crushed by a mammoth or having to go without food for a day or not being able to sleep in the cave overnight than forget about it, forgive my error and repeat it too easily and end up dead down the line. So I think that's where our own harshness on ourselves comes from. While the forgiving nature for others and kind of giving them more grace, I think there's an element of wanting to not burn bridges and not lose social ties, and maybe that's tribal and maybe that's evolutionary as well, where we don't want to be excluded or lose our network. But equally, regarding others, I think sometimes we can give grace and forgiveness too easily, and I don't typically. I think I forgive, but I don't forget, and this will be an insight that the Campbell family motto in Latin is ne obliveraris, which is forget not. And that means that you should remember the previous deeds of those around you, and it should inform to some extent your future dealings with those individuals. Now, that might sound a bit, how would I describe that? It might sound a bit like you're holding on to old wounds and keeping old trauma, but I don't think it's fully the case. I think it's more remember how people around you acted and be wary of that in the future, and don't allow it to maybe burn you twice. Question number 16. Does being in a relationship limit your self-growth? It certainly could do, but I don't think it should if you're with the right person. One thing that's screaming out at me here is that comfort can be a killer, though, and you have to be strong to resist that, particularly if you've been with somebody for a period of time, and maybe there's elements of you evolving as a person, them evolving as a person, or maybe you're evolving and they're not evolving. I think that would be the risk, and I know a lot of people in the kind of manosphere community have spoken about this, where the kind of classic example, it'd be much easier to lay in bed a little bit later in the morning. Your girlfriend might love the fact that you're choosing to spend company with her and show your affection in that regard, rather than going and pursuing something that you told yourself was important maybe the night before, the day before, when you weren't in that situation. But if you're building something and as a man you need to push forward and fit in your training or go and get something done, then you simply cannot allow yourself to be derailed from that perspective. I think you should give your partner and your girlfriend the attention that she needs in the time that you can choose to assign to that, but not to go beyond that, because I actually think that's in the end becomes disrespectful to them as well, because then you're not leveling up and helping them too. One of the phrases that I use very commonly on podcasts is that a rising tide raises all ships. And if you aren't being the rising tide, then how are you going to raise up your girlfriend or your significant other? Equally, I don't want this to sound entirely from a male perspective. That's the only perspective I can speak from personal experience. But I do know that a lot of women will go on like fat loss journeys and they'll cut out some takeaways, they'll cut out a bit of drinking, and their boyfriend will hate it. They'll be like, "Oh, why are you like so focused on that? You look fine the way you are." That for me is a massive red flag that somebody is becoming uncomfortable with you pursuing the best version of yourself, because they want to keep you where you are, because that's where they feel comfortable viewing you as. And I think that is where being in a relationship could limit your self-growth if somebody is uncomfortable with you pursuing self-growth. So that's the big consideration there. 17. So, sometimes I have to choose whether to include a question. There was two in this one. One answering what a woman is, but I chose to do that. And this one I've chosen to do it as well. What should you do if your ex was a throat goat? Okay, so if your ex's head game was that great, then that's really good for her and congratulations. And I'm sure you enjoyed it at the time, but that cannot be her sole offering and her sole benefit. And it's certainly not good enough to go back and deal with any other issues that meant that you're referring to her as your ex. That's got to be front of mind. Do the benefits outweigh the cons? Do the pros outweigh the cons? That's the consideration. And I think sexual ability is not important enough for you to overlook any other issues that led to her being your ex. Number 18, I'm struggling to get deep work done. Do you take any nootropics? I've not experimented a lot in this space, and I think there's lots of foundations we need to lay before we explore other supplements or potential sticking plasters over gaping wounds. So if you're somebody that has really bad discipline with their phone, has poor environment design, doesn't eat particularly well, doesn't hydrate particularly well, doesn't really have clear intentions and goals and structure, then I would address those boxes first. However, I have just got some lion's mane delivered from Vibey, who I use their meal replacement shakes. They've expanded into that space, and I've got their capsules for lion's mane mushroom. And there's a lot of evidence with that shows that they can improve both mood and focus. So while I think I've ticked a lot of the prerequisite boxes like environment, diet, intentions, focus, and structure, the little icing on top of the cake, which might even be more than that, it might even be the mixture for the cake if it goes really well. Lion's Mane may do that, so I will keep people updated with that. And previous episodes have been sponsored by Vibey, so you can definitely check out my discount code for them, and the link will be in some previous episodes. So yeah, I'm looking forward to trying that. Number 19, top 3 places you've traveled and top 3 you want to visit. Hands up, complete honesty. Anyone that's listened for a long period of time will probably know this already, but I've not been massively focused on travel, and it's certainly not been a value of mine that's been top of the agenda. But I have enjoyed holidays to Dubai and Ibiza, both places I've gone many, many times, and enjoyed both elements of the experience in terms of from a tourist and sightseeing perspective, but also the partying and the dining and the general like experience in terms of like luxury in both those places. Third on that list would be my childhood family destination, which was the Isle of Arran. We used to go on holiday probably for about 10 years there for the same fortnight in July. And as a family holiday, it was absolutely incredible in terms of activity, scenery, and it's got its own little microclimate to some extent. Yes, it rains sometimes, but more often than not, we had fantastic weather. Now, 3 that are top that I want to visit. I think every time I see photos of the Amalfi Coast, I am drawn to it as a experience. I think it looks visually stunning. I think the lifestyle looks incredible there in terms of going on a little boat, having like a beautiful meal overlooking the scenery. That would be incredible. That or Rome are probably the ones that I would consider from that kind of holiday and that kind of perspective. I've never been to America, so I think New York for the sightseeing and the general hubbub of a large city like that, I think that would be very interesting. And then, of course, I think with my podcast hat on, I think I would want to go to Austin, Texas, which appears very much to be like the place, the mecca for podcasting at the moment. So that would definitely be on my list. 20, best ways to find your purpose in life. Does everyone have a dream job, or can it be money to live? Something I've been talking about lots recently, including with Rob Henderson, and then including on some guest appearances that I've done on other podcasts, has been the childhood consideration. And that is from a book called Quiet by Susan Cain. And she talks about looking at what you enjoyed doing as a child when there was no fiscal element to it, and you found relative enjoyment from, a relative flow from, and it's something that could be transferred into a career or a business or a side project when you're older. So for me, I was very keen to be a sports journalist. I loved writing reports. I loved interviewing sports players and asking them questions. And I liked preparing for it as well, which is a big part of what I do now as a podcaster. So I think there's an element of looking back and seeing what I enjoyed when I was younger, And equally applying that to what would be the modern day equivalent of that, and what would I benefit from trying to do that when I'm older. Equally, I think it's important to note that that could be a side project, or it could be your full-time job. You could do your full-time job to give you money to do the things that you enjoyed as a child in your free time. And if you earn enough money and you don't hate your job, you could use that money to buy back freedom and time and ensure that you're spending your time purposefully outside of that. And even within my job, so I am working in the furniture industry and I'm selling furniture to student accommodation providers across the UK. That doesn't necessarily link to anything I love to do as a child, but it has a lot of purpose and fulfillment to it, because I joined a business that had a lot of capabilities but was underperforming. The unit that I was in was turning over about just over £1 million. In my first year, we increased that significantly. In our second year, we almost doubled that. That's really exciting. In our third year, we're going to try and go again. That's really exciting to be part of, and to be the reason, or a reason, that a business is growing is really purposeful in my career. So because of my phone calls and emails and meetings and quotes and proposals and presentations, the revenues increased, the profits increased, the business is better structured. I'm able to earn more money. That is purposeful. And while it's not a dream job, it's money to live, and I feel quite good doing it. So I think that's a good way to think about having a purpose in life and feeling good. And I know that people that have had children talk on the podcast, they talk about setting a good example for their kids, earning money to provide for the family and give them a lifestyle that they want them to have. So there's a lot to be said for that. Quick drink of water and we'll go into 21, which is it's a juicy one. Okay. Okay, 21. Partner or cheerleader. Now, this is from my friend and fellow podcaster Caroline Milne, sorry. And she asked this in the last podcast, and I dodged it. So she's asked me again. I'm going to dive into it. So, partner or cheerleader is a concept which is related to relationships, and this is where you would optimize for one or the other, and the dynamic between the two of you. So, husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend. And there's a misconception that a cheerleader is inferior sometimes, or puts her own goals behind that of yours. That there is an element of a cheerleader being a supporting actress to the main role, in that they're trying to make your life easier, and they're backing you, and they're helping you, and they're supporting you. That could be helping domestically. It could be backing you relentlessly and giving you encouragement, and like really throwing their weight and energy behind your goals and helping however they can. A partnership, in contrast, is when there's probably two high performers who collaborate, and this can work, but I think it appears to be harder when you have two high-powered people. The two that I think of when I think of that are the Hormozes. So Layla and Alex Hormozy are two high performers that are both striving for excellence. But I'm trying to think of other examples that spring immediately to mind, but it's less prominent in my mind at this moment in time. This has become more interesting in the modern age, where we have more women who have successfully achieved more education, more power, more status, and with that, more money. So the lines have become a little bit more blurred. And I haven't figured out from a personal perspective exactly what I need. I do really enjoy spending time with somebody that has ambition and is driven. And while I definitely lean traditionally, I do like traditionally from like a male provider perspective, female supports the family perspective, because that's how I was raised, and that's how it seems to produce the best results for children. And that was what Rob Henderson was sharing in the last episode, which a lot of you gave me great feedback on. I think having somebody that's got a lot going on is pretty attractive. So somebody that's got goals and ambitions. I would worry if they didn't have some element of that they would become bored. But imagine you worked on something together, and while, yes, you might be the lead role, quote unquote, which is where this concept talks about, and they might be cheerleading and supporting you to that, they would still be a powerful individual, and they're not exactly like a meek boring individual that has nothing going on for themselves. So yeah, there's a lot to be said for the partner or the cheerleader concept. I don't think it covers all eventualities, and I don't know how up to date it is with the modern world, and I don't know necessarily what I need. Who knows? We'll soon find out. Question 22. Are you scared of audience capture? This is a concept by Gwinder Bogle on his Substack, where creators lean into and become captured by what their audience always gives good feedback on, to the extent that they lose their authenticity and focus and intentions and the values that they started out with. So there's some examples that he gives, and the main one is a YouTuber called Nicholas Perry, who's now better known as Nikado Avocado. He went from being a vegan to then sharing him eating meals, talking to the camera as if you were at dinner together, to then going on to doing like really extreme eating challenges where you would eat like the entire menu at a fast food restaurant. And this has had quite an impact, and you can actually Google Nikado Avocado if you want to see what I mean from a health perspective. But from an audience capture consideration, for me personally, I really take what the audience wants seriously. I love feedback, whether it's LinkedIn, Instagram, emails. I love hearing what people who listen to the podcast think of episodes, think of guests, think of my questions, think of my research, think of my production quality. That's important, but never at the cost of the overall breadth of guests and the topics that I'm trying to bring to this. Because as I said at the start, my specific knowledge is broadly categorized under self-development. It's not a fitness podcast, a business podcast, a mindset podcast, an investing podcast. Equally, if I was to look at the data, these solo podcasts perform really, really well and regularly outperform guests who I know that if people listen to them, they would get value, but I would be less interesting and have less anecdotes to share if I just did solo episodes. If I wasn't interviewing people who I was learning from and upskilling from and bringing stories to the table from, these solo podcasts would be a lot more boring and I wouldn't be self-developing at the same rate. So the data might tell me, Colin, do a solo episode more often than every 10 because you would get more downloads. But I know that the solo episodes perform well because I'm doing the other things in the background to make this conversation, which hopefully you're enjoying up until this point, interesting. Beyond that, the data also indicates that personal finance does really well. But I think the self-development is wider than just money. Money is so important, and I will not have anyone tell me otherwise. But mindset, health, performance, relationships, these are all vitally important as well, and I want to cover them. So I don't think I'm massively in danger of becoming audience captured, or I would just produce lots of solo episodes with lots of personal finance discussions. And while there's definitely an element of me doing enough of those to give you guys what you need, I feel that I can bring lots more to the table, and I'm going to continue to do that. And you guys can keep voting and with your listens and your attention and your feedback to me, and that'll be great to help shape how the show goes. Question 23. What's your go-to songs for euphoria or focus or inspiration? Recency bias always plays a role here, so I'm trying to be nostalgic when I answer these questions, but the euphoria one, I'm going to be very recent. And I've been listening to Edge of 17 Wookiee Radio on Spotify, and I'm telling you, that playlist is unbelievable. It's got the new Ellie Goulding and Calvin Harris Miracle song, and that is, for euphoria at the moment, you just feel like, oh my goodness, like an old school dance tune, isn't it? And you just feel buzzing after it. For focus, I've been on this one for over a year, and I strongly recommend it. It's Kanye West, Use This Gospel. And I first heard it at Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO live show last year. And I'd never heard this song before, and I consider myself to be somebody that liked Kanye West music. And I've been having it on a loop, and I'd have like the loop version on YouTube that just plays over and over, or on Spotify, you can just have it on loop as well. And yeah, I love writing to that. I love researching written guests for that, and I love creating to that, which is cool. And then inspiration. I think inspiration is a funny term, isn't it? That could apply to so many different things, whether that's like, oh, inspiration to be creative or inspiration to train hard. So if I'm thinking about it from like a kind of training or hype perspective, I feel ready to lift anything during Drake Forever. It was one of the songs that we used to play at the rugby club gym when I was first starting getting into lifting. So it brings me back to like young Colin doing bicep curls or doing squats or doing bent over rows or pull-ups for the first time. So that feels great. Don't ask me to pick my favorite verse in that track though, because that was very, very difficult. I think somebody might have asked me on that in a solo podcast before. Maybe it was an Instagram Q&A back in the day. But if you're enjoying up to this point, tell me who's your favorite verse from Drake Forever. Number 24. What's a unique insight that you realize only you can bring to conversations? Similar to what I said in question 1, specifically, I don't think there's like a massive unique factor about what I do. But I'm confident in my ability to listen to exactly what somebody's saying, to be very present, to be hyper tuned in, to understand what they're saying and where it's coming from, assess why they might be saying it, what might be being left unsaid by them, and either choosing to probe a little bit further or bring a practical follow up or a suggestion or summary of what they've said. You'll hear me do this lots in the podcast. So sometimes I will summarize what someone has said straight back to me and kind of give an indication of what I think they've said and what point they've made. And then I'll just wait. I won't ask a question. And the guest will often agree and expand, or they'll somewhat agree and they'll re-clarify exactly what they meant. It means that you don't get too many open loops in the conversations that we have. So I think there'll certainly be occasions where you're listening to a guest and you're like, oh, I wish Colin had like expanded on that particular section, and maybe we've run out of time, or maybe we have moved on to another topic. But I definitely try and probe a little bit further so you understand exactly what somebody's meaning, and there's not a case of, oh, I'm not sure what those two were talking about there. Question 25, you're non-negotiable for friendships. My genuine close friends need to be reliable. If you're not reliable, I won't let you in. If you're flaky, then I quite simply can't really trust you the same as I can trust somebody that's reliable. You can certainly be an acquaintance of mine if you're a little bit flaky and a little bit not like 100% reliable, but you're not getting to get in close because you're not able to be relied upon. Number 26, which finance related guest have you learned the most from? For me, it's Pete Matthew. Great question, and I'm very glad you enjoyed Pete Matthew coming on the show. That was a great episode 150, the podfather of UK finance, and for good reason. He is extremely tuned in, and it's so practical as well. We talked about pensions, talked about ISAs, talked about investing. I think if you were to look at Andrew Craig, episode 42, is probably a similar level to Pete. I think a lot of people listened to that and got started investing for the first time back in 2020. And I think on a practical level, it gave you some really, really good guidance. One thing that I disagree with Andrew on is his rule 100 minus your age for a split between equities and bonds, because I definitely think when you listen to the Pete Matthew episode and some of the more recent guests that I've had, like Nick Magilli or Daniel Crosby or even Damien Talks Money, and Andy Hart as well. God, we've had a lot of really good finance guests recently. We have all spoken about having a much higher equity content within your portfolio than bonds because of the way bonds have performed and because of the typical age demographic and time frames of the people that listen to this podcast. So if you go back, I think episode 42 with Andrew Craig is a big one. Pete Matthew 150 is this listener's called out is a great one too. And as a little bit of an exclusive for you guys, I haven't announced this anywhere else yet, but Andrew Craig is coming back on the podcast during May, June. He's got another book coming out. This will be his third book. And we got talking on LinkedIn, and I think he's going to be coming back on. Question 27. Have you looked into finasteride fatigue and its effectiveness slowing down over time? This relates to the hair loss drug finasteride that I've taken since I was 21. I've not read or watched lots on the effects slowing down over time, but I've absolutely still experienced between the ages of 21 and at the time of recording 30, I've still experienced some thinning around my temples and some element of recession. And I believe that finasteride will, of course, have some element of limiting the amount of recession or hair loss I've experienced. But being a guy with relatively high natural testosterone levels and DHT production, some of the loss is going to be relatively inevitable when combined with my genetic heritage. So finasteride losing effect over time, perhaps, but I definitely think that it's been overall effective for me where I haven't needed to drastically act. While I don't have the full head of hair to the same extent I had when I was 21, it's not. I've not gone bald, so that's definitely like an upside to it. Do I think it's become less effective over time? Maybe. I've kept the same dosage over time, which has been one small capsule on a daily. I think it's 1 gram. So maybe that's a consideration. You're probably, if you really want to go deep on finasteride, you should probably check out the episode I did with Darren Lee, which I think is 125, and then Darren's YouTube channel. He's the host of Kickoff Sessions podcast, which is a great show, by the way. You've hopefully heard him twice in this show now as a guest, and then once on a roundtable. He has probably 3 or 4 video series on finasteride and on hair loss and how he managed to improve his own hair. And kind of transformed it over a year and then a 2-year basis. So that would be worth checking out if you want to go deeper on finasteride and hair loss. Question 28. Is the long-term goal the email list to monetize it? If so, what with? First and foremost, the email list is an outlet for me to write on. Instagram changed radically in the last 4 or 5 years. From when I was first on it, you used to post kind of shreddy gym photo and then a big long caption talking about whatever you want to talk about, whether it was training, nutrition, or mindset. That changed where we're now definitely optimized for video and short captions. So it was an outlet for me to write, for starters. It's also a way to outsource from social media reliance. Now, at the time of recording today, genuinely, my Instagram potentially is being deactivated and banned for a period until I can appeal it, because I got spammed over the last few days with bot account followers that I've been trying to delete and remove. And I've reported the individual that was trying to sell me followers and said no. And then they've then sent them to my account without me paying for them and as a trial. And I've said, no, I don't want a trial. And Instagram has flagged that this has happened. And I've not been able to remove some of them because I've been removing so many. It's flagged it as like, so say if you liked a lot of photos, sometimes Instagram thinks you're employing some sort of bot to do it for you. I was removing like hundreds of followers across like an hour period, and it was like, you're using this function a lot. Can you tell us that this is unusual activity or something like that? So I've been flagged for all sorts. So God knows what's going to happen there. But the email list, that is much less regulated by a social media company. So that's outsourced. So that is owned by me, well, or Gmail to some extent. But it's a lot less regulated, and email addresses have been with us long before Instagram, long before Bebo, long before MySpace, if we think about previous platforms which have since disappeared. So it's important to do that. In terms of monetizing the email list, I could, of course, send sponsored opportunities through there. So if I do, in the same way that there's a podcast sponsor at the start of these episodes, I could have a podcast sponsor at the start of my email list, which would be possible. If you thought there was still value from reading the email even after a sponsor, that would be cool. And again, it would be similar to the podcast where I was choosing a sponsor that was very much in line with the values of the podcast and where I wanted it to go. Equally, in the longer term, I'm sure I would love to offer some sort of guidance or coaching or course through that. And many of you know that I was writing a book for the 15 biggest self-development lessons from the first 150 episodes of the podcast, but I shelved that because the podcast gave me the opportunity to get to that stage. So I decided to keep doubling down on the quality and the focus on the podcast. So that's been put on ice for now, but the email list would be a way for me to distribute that as well. So the email list right now is just a focus to give me an outlet to write, give me an outlet to share great content with you guys, and to remove reliance entirely on social media. So with that in mind, please do hit the link in the show notes and join it, because we're a bit choppy waters when it comes to Instagram at the moment. Question number 29. Where are your quarter zips from? I've got quite a few now. If it's not got a Ralph Lauren logo on it, which I've got a couple of those. I've got a Lacoste one, which is more casual. The ones that are unbranded in terms of like a big logo, I've got 3 from Reese, and they are a pretty good fit, and they've got a good range of colors, and the quality of them is excellent. So that's where all my quarter zips come from: Ralph Lauren, Reese, and Lacoste. Number 30. We're in the home straight now. What is the best piece of advice you've been given, and why is it the best? Immediately when I'm answering this off the cuff, I'm thinking of a quote that has been my favorite quote for a very, very long time. It's often assigned to Jerry Rice, and while that's sometimes debated, we'll just, for the purposes of this discussion, we'll say that Jerry Rice said this. Today, I will do what others will not, so tomorrow I can do what others cannot. Now, Jerry Rice is talking from an athletic capability and training perspective, but I think you can apply it anywhere you like. I love the idea that doing the work today that others chose not to do allows you down the line that work pays off and gives you capabilities that are beyond those that didn't do the work. That is delayed gratification, sacrifice and discipline being rewarded. That is like one of my favorite concepts in reality. So, as advice, I think that quote is excellent. Basically, do the work that others are shying away from. And in the longer term, it'll pay off and give you the ability to do things that they couldn't possibly dream of. So, whether that's training, whether that's researching and reading, whether that's turning up when you said you would, even though you don't feel like it, that's incredible. And I love that advice. And why it's the best. Why is it the best piece of advice? I just think it speaks to me on a level that gets my brain firing. Okay, 31. Last question for this time round. And if your question didn't get answered this time, it's either been banked for next time or it's been answered in a previous solo Q&A. So if your question hasn't come up, please go back and listen to some of the other solos. They should be, most of the ones are ending in 9. So like 169, 159, 149, 139, 129, etc., and back the way. Although some of the much, much older ones, they're not quite as organized as that. But since the podcast has been a bit more regimented, you can hopefully go and find those. Number 31. What areas of your life do you aim to grow in the next year? I largely think that 2023, I'm focused on many of the same areas, while of course acknowledging that I cannot push some of the other areas in terms of progression. So let me explain that. I think career and income and fulfillment from that are still dialed up hard, and I'm pushing to do more. The podcast and the impact that it has, that's being pushed to do more. I'm probably maintaining physically how I look, but while becoming more capable with the boxing. So becoming more physically capable while aesthetically staying roughly the same. Socially, that's probably an area for growth as well, because I think I can do more in terms of holidays and experiences and events. And so that's going to require more of a focus to grow in that. Equally, every area of growth that I'm choosing to dive into is underpinned by serving both my current self at this moment in time and making sure that my future self is happy with my choices and is given the best opportunity to be happy and healthy when that time comes around as well. So making sure that everything that I'm doing aligns with my values both now and what I expect future Colin's values to be like as well. Those are the areas that I'm hoping to grow in the next year. That wraps up another solo Q&A. That's been just over 50 minutes of listening to my dulcet tones. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for tuning in and giving me the opportunity to do this on a weekly or sometimes twice weekly basis. The best free ways to support the show are to make sure you've left a rating on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Please hit the 5 stars, or copy and paste the link to this episode or an episode that's a favorite of yours to a friend that might enjoy it. And genuinely, if everyone listening did that, we would double our audience, and think about the guests I could get if we continued to double and grow each time. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back to speak to you all again very soon.